Hi, all. DT Neal here, talking to you about stories, storytelling, genre, writerly things, and in this case specifically, fantasy. About time, right? I have a lot I could say about fantasy, but for me, one of the visceral pleasures of fantasy stories, whether writing them or reading them, is the prevalence of geography, specifically maps. I love maps. Maps for me anchor so much of a fantasy story. And it's interesting because I don't really think about map work with regard to any science fiction or even horror, but I do think about it with fantasy. To the extent that for me, as much as I love world building, and I do love world building, I need a map for a fantasy story, for it to feel real, for it to be real. It has to have a map. And that goes deep for me. I was of that generation, being a Gen Xer. I was of that generation who we were that when Dungeons and Dragons became a big thing. You know, I was gifted a number of first edition books, which I still have, back in 1979, and right in the middle, right before like the Satanic Panic that occurred, when everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, kids are getting together and using their imaginations. That must be bad." All that stuff. It did hit me between that and the Lord of the Rings books, and Michael Moorcock. Loved Michael Moorcock, huge influence on me. The maps, the presence of maps, it's deep seated in me, and I love them. I love maps. I love drawing them out and creating them and creating places of interest and moments and places to go. And when you do that in a fantasy context, it's very rewarding. And there's a real pleasure with that. And I also paid attention to things in my Sagas of Earth series, which is 6 books right now, probably 3 more books to do in that one to finish it. Paid attention to that linguistic conventions in specific areas, cultural touch points, geographic touch points, how people react, all of that. I have a great fondness for that. It's a key component of world building, and it's so satisfying when you do that, when you can look at a map. But I still have these maps that I've drawn years and years and years and years ago. They're not on parchment or anything like that, but they are old maps that reflect my efforts of world building, especially for Earth. I have another world that I have characters for it, and even maps and geography and cultures. I wrote one book for that world, but that hasn't come out. I've held on to that. And it's funny for me because that world's very real because I mapped it and I created it. I can see it and I look at that and go, I know, I haven't, your stories aren't out there yet. Sorry. But I think anybody who loves geography, I think, is a natural for loving fantasy. I think there's a real pleasure in that, in discovering new places and looking at terrain and how it's represented in a map, and the idea of anything: forests, mountains, lakes, rivers, oceans, coastlines, volcanoes, anything like that in a fantasy setting has its own reward. That sense of place is integral to appreciation of fantasy. And if you don't like geography, fantasy's really not for you, I don't think, as a genre. And I always did love geography. I loved it. I loved learning about those places, little grottos and caves and all those kind of things. And it's funny because, like I said, I don't do that kind of map work with my science fiction. I don't. Even though I may be thinking about places in terms of the worlds in question a great deal, I don't map them out. So it's an interesting, for me at least, personally, like a psychological differentiation that I have between the fantasy and science fiction, and certainly horror. even though I do think about the places and I do think about where things are and what's where, because, again, in any kind of world building, you have to, but I don't map them out in those other genres, only in fantasy. So, there it is. I greatly enjoy it. There's a lot of aspects I could talk about more with regard to fantasy, but at the very least, you need to have a good map. It has to be evocative of a region. It can't be derivative either. It can't be too tightly tied to the world as we know it, because while at the same time having reference points that might conjure up things. Like for me, George R.R. Martin's work, while influential to me, at least the first 4 books were way back in the long ago times, I remember always chafing at his basically flipping Great Britain, just flipping it and letting that be his world. And I know he certainly drew from the Wars of the Roses for so much of what he did in there. Him just flipping that Great Britain always felt to me like, really? Like, that felt to me to be a kind of a cop-out, because I was always like, just make a new world. Don't like, oh, the Dornish live in what's Cornwall. It's like, okay, so Cornish, Dornish, got it. etc. I could pull any number of examples. King's Landing, London much? Yeah, etc. I just feel like for me that was always a little bit of a sticking point. And I don't know if he just was like, yeah, screw it, we'll just put it in here and that's what it's going to be. And then he didn't. And then over time, he's like, oh, okay. Or maybe he didn't care. I mean, he didn't finish the series, so maybe he doesn't care. Piers Anthony with Xanth, like, it's Florida. Like, the map is Florida. And that always bothered me, because I was like, you can call these things all these funky names, but it's still Florida. What are you doing? I feel like if you're pulling from other cultures, that's fine for fantasy work, but let the map at least, let it be original enough that it feels like a different place. That's my take. Plenty of those are huge writers, so nobody, I guess, really cares, but I kind of care. I do feel like a fantasy world, to be a proper fantasy world, needs to be distinct in many ways. Even if you're pulling, like I said, from touch points from other cultures into the fusion that is whatever culture that you're doing, the look, you shouldn't be like, that looks like Nebraska. You shouldn't do that. I don't think. I think it diminishes the fantasy aspects of it. If you take refuge in the known geography, it should be unknown geography. Similar features, but just expressed differently. I think that's more satisfying.